think there was a statistic out there on just territory. While it's not a huge number, I believe Russia in the month of April alone of 2024 basically reversed and then some whatever Ukraine was able to gain in that counteroffensive that lasted for 6+ months. So, Scott, your analysis of where Russia is on the battlefield now, and maybe you can place it in the context of where Russia has come.
Well, first of all, understand that Russia has said for some time now that it will, if Ukraine continues to attack Russian territory, that Russia will seek to build a buffer zone designed to push Ukrainian capabilities back so that they can't reach Russian territory. And so what Putin has said is that, okay, you forced our hands. We're in the process of making this buffer zone. If you take a look at the range of some of the weapons that Ukraine's using, that buffer zone takes you right up to Kharkov. So even though Putin's saying our goal isn't to take Kharkov, it's sort of one of the byproducts of creating the buffer zone necessary to keep Ukraine from striking Russian territory. But it's not the primary objective. The objective is to continue to destroy the Ukrainian military, part of the demilitarization goal of the special military operation, and to create this buffer zone. But the real goal here is that this offensive is designed to extend Ukraine's already depleted forces even further. Ukraine had to divert reserves that were needed on the primary line of contact, the eastern Ukrainian line of contact with Russia. Where they already have insufficient manpower, they've already said we don't have enough people to hold this line. The troops that were coming in to basically, delay the Russian victory had to be diverted to Kharkov, where they've been destroyed. Entire brigades have disappeared. Other brigades have refused to engage because they recognize the suicidal aspect of the tasking. And now you have, collapse in the north. That's taken away the strategic reserve. You have insufficient forces on the previous line of contact that are now being stretched thin. The Russians are making dramatic advances there. That was the purpose. And my guess is that you're going to see 1, 2, or maybe even 3 additional fronts being opened up that are designed to continue to stretch the Ukrainians to the breaking point, and probably by the time the last front is opened up, one might speculate in the Zaporizhia area, there are no Ukrainian forces left, and that will lead to a dramatic reversal of fortune for the Ukrainians. They are holding on to prepared positions, but a key aspect of the prepared positions in a war of attrition is the ability to rotate units in and out. So you send a brigade in, it holds for a certain period of time, and then it's rotated out so that it can rest and refit. Another brigade comes in. The Ukrainians don't have brigades to rotate out. So these brigades are in there and they're just getting chewed up and chewed up and chewed up. And if they stay there, they'll all die. And so, eventually the Ukrainians are either going to have to sacrifice the brigade and then they have nothing, or they're going to have to try to preserve the combat cohesion of that brigade and pull it back to, new defensive positions. But they haven't been preparing these positions in depth along the totality. There's a couple places that are handpicked where they've done the high profile preparation. This is where Zelensky does his tour and looks and nods and everything. But that's just a small stretch of the line. It's like the Maginot Line. Well, the Germans didn't say, well, there's the Maginot Line. Let's send everything straight in the Maginot Line. They went, we'll go around it. And so the Russians will just go around it, and then it becomes a useless defensive position. Troops that are in there are going to be stuck, hit with Fab 500s, Fab 1500s. They'll all die. Or they retreat, but retreat to what? There's no prepared positions. And so you may see a precipitous retreat, panicked retreat, an absolute rout as Ukrainians run to the Dnieper River to try and get across the Dnieper River and use the Dnieper River as a physical barrier against the Russians. This is why the Russians, back in March, I believe, announced the creation of something called the Dnieper River Flotilla. Now, why would you need a Dnieper River Flotilla if you don't control the Dnieper River? It indicates that Russia plans on controlling the Dnieper River and making that part of their line of contact with the Ukrainians. This is the direction we're heading right now. The purpose of the Kharkov offensive, in addition to killing Ukrainians and creating a buffer, is to create operational opportunity, strategic opportunity for the Russian armed forces so they can exploit their superiority in manpower and equipment. Russia's getting stronger every day. The Ukrainians are not killing the Russians quicker than the Russians can replace them. So every day Russia actually gets stronger and stronger. Ukraine, on the other hand, is losing men in huge numbers and they can't replace them. So every day Ukraine gets weaker and weaker. And eventually the military math correlation is such that Russia will swamp Ukraine. And study your World War II history, study the destruction of Army Group Center, German Army Group in the summer of 1944. The Russians called it Operation Bagration. And that's what is about to happen to the Ukrainians.
Yeah. And Scott, given this fact, how do you see NATO, the United States, maybe this amorphous thing called the collective West, spinning this? Because there's a lot of, I think, even more so than perhaps the period when Ukraine was having immense trouble during the counter-offensive. There's a lot of fear amongst at least the NATO foreign policy establishment. Here you have the Atlantic Council talking about how Ukraine's Western allies should fear Russian victory, not Russian defeat. But at the same time as they're talking about how scared they are about Russian victory, I can just scroll down toward the end. They talk about Russian victory is not inevitable, that Russia can still be defeated if the West takes the decisive step of committing itself to Ukrainian victory. And then here we go. Supplying Ukraine with the sufficient weapons. We've heard this all before, to defend itself. But crucially, and this is what we've kind of been hitting on so far, ending absurd restrictions on the use of Western weapons and allowing strikes on legitimate military targets inside of Russia, providing Ukraine with the kind of guaranteed long-term military support that will convince Putin his hopes of outlasting the West are futile. So that's the Atlantic Council. That's NATO's think tank. How do you see NATO spinning this? I mean, even just that, they're talking about Russia's victory being something that should be feared, but at the same time, they're saying it's not inevitable, despite the fact that reality is essentially saying it is. So how do we square that, Scott?
Well, I think one of the premises of that article is that NATO has some sort of technological supremacy or superiority over Russia that, if allowed to be applied without restriction in Ukraine, would tip the tables in favor of Ukraine. Look, there's no doubt that NATO has capabilities that haven't been brought to bear. Russia has capabilities that haven't been brought to bear either. One of the things we've seen, though, is every time a NATO capability, HIMARS, ATACMS, Leopard tanks, Martyrs, Bradleys, Abrams, is brought to bear, the Russians almost immediately have a solution. The other thing that we have to understand is that we have to take at face value what General Christopher Cavoli said in early 2023 when he spoke to, I believe it was a Swedish defense forum. And he said that NATO hasn't imagined the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place in Ukraine. And the important thing about that statement is all military planning, everything you do in the military, from your organizational structure to the tactics to logistics, it's all based upon the imagined conflict you're preparing to fight. So you imagine what war is going to be like, what ammunition expenditure rates are, how you plan on approaching the battlefield, what your maneuver is, how much gas you need, things of this nature. Air support, artillery support, communication support, electronic warfare support. The whole scope and scale of warfare is imagined beforehand, because that's how you're going to fight. That's when you pull the operation plan off the shelf and you open it up and say, execute Op Plan 1084. Boom, Op Plan 1084, drive to, Kharkiv. We will use 2 corps online, 3rd Corps in reserve. Corps consist of divisions organized into battalion, combat teams, It's all laid out there. The problem is all that thinking we have dates back to the Cold War. War today ain't the Cold War. So the entire plan that NATO wants to implement, that includes how NATO seeks to employ specific weapon systems, what the desired effect on the battlefield is of the employment. ATACMS was conceived as a suppression of enemy air defense system. That's how we used it, actually. The one time we used it in significant numbers during the second Gulf War. We basically brought ATACMS up to close to the forward edge of the battle area and started firing it up and take out, the Iraqi air defense, and then also take out Iraqi artillery, command and control. That was the idea. It doesn't work that way anymore. You see, the Russians have learned from HIMARS. HIMARS taught Russia a lesson that you can't put all your command and control in one forward command post and have it sit there for a minute and then have a HIMARS get the target, the target coordinates from SIGINT and imagery satellites that pick it up, feed the target real time. You fire the HIMARS, it hits the command post, and boom, you're in trouble. The Russians have learned that you have to have an Alpha Bravo Charlie command post that you're jumping and moving all the time. That while one command post is set in, 2 are moving to establish a primary and a secondary so that you never lose command and control. If the enemy gets lucky and hits this one, the other one's ready to jump up and take while the other one's moving. And while that's moving, they're rebuilding a third one and they're juggling that around. So you're not going to take out Russian command and control like was envisioned in the original op plan. Logistics. The Russians don't bring all their ammunition forward to a Ford ammo depot that then goes out to feed things up. That's how the enemy targets it and blows it all up. So the Russians now keep their ammunition way in the rear, and they bring it in smaller packets and break it up, and then push that forward to making a more difficult target. Now, this slows down the pace of combat because you now have a more constrained logistics tail, but it makes it sustainable and survivable. See, the Russians maybe not be able to do the big arrow pushes anymore because that requires a lot of logistics pushed forward. But what Russia could do is sustain continuous lethality on the battlefield without the ability of the enemy interdicting it and causing them to pause. Russia's rewritten the rules. NATO's way of fighting a war today, it doesn't reflect that. So we're coming in thinking we're ready to execute an op plan that's based upon Russian tactics that might have been valid in 2022. But the Russians adapt rapidly. Their academies, we have a place in Fort Leavenworth, the United States, called the School of Advanced Military Studies, SAMS. And I remember during the first Gulf War, SAMS was given the task of coming up with the way to defeat the Iraqis who were all dug in. And they came up with what Schwarzkopf called the Hail Mary, the left hook. Basically, we would fix the Iraqis and then move a corps out here, and then that corps would launch this attack through the unprotected flank and run up in the rear of the Iraqis. It was considered genius maneuver warfare at the time. It was, but they conceived it. That was their thing. That's what they did. But it basically was an adaptation of existing doctrine. It wasn't new doctrine. It was just basically these guys took the doctrine and applied it operationally. During the war in Afghanistan, we needed to switch from counter guerrilla warfare, where we had a doctrine for how to defeat guerrilla warfare, and go to this hearts and minds friendly counterinsurgency thing. And David Petraeus, set something up at SAMS, and they all came in and they set this whole think tank up and they rewrote it. And it took them a long time to write it. And even by the time they get it down there, the space and time between conceiving the need, executing the need, and getting it back to the troops was too long. So the war had already outpaced the doctrine that was being brought in. They were always chasing themselves. It's not how the Russians operate. The Russians right now, as the battlefield progresses, are pulling leaders from the front line, people who did something innovative. They said, that was pretty damn cool. You're out, you're in the Combined Arms Academy. We're going to bring a discussion group together, and we're going to discuss what you did and figure out the important points. And then we're going to try and capture that in temporary doctrine. We want to write it up, and then we're going to quickly get that down to the training. And as the war progresses, they're pulling units out. As they rotate them out, they say, hey, you're trained in last month's way of fighting war, but now we have a new way of fighting war based upon what's been happening technological wise, and we're going to retrain. So they go back out and they get retrained, and they immediately come back in. Compresses this. The Russians are adapting far quicker. So the notion that NATO has a solution for the Russian problem is absurd. The Russian military today is the most combat hardened, combat experienced, capable combat force on the planet because they're doing it right. They're rapidly adjusting to the realities. They do drone warfare like no one can imagine drone warfare. They're doing things with electronic warfare that have the Ukrainians confused, and the Ukrainians are pretty good. And it has NATO definitely going, we don't know what just happened there. All the things that are supposed to work aren't working. Why don't our, satellite guided bombs work? Those were wonderful against the Iraqis and the Afghans. Man, we could have satellite guided bombs. The special forces, JTACs could call them in, and we're blowing people up. It's wonderful. We're a superpower. Let's use them against the Russians. And what's going on? They're jammed. They don't work. HIMARS, jammed. Doesn't work. ATACMS, increasingly jammed. Doesn't work. The Russians have an electronic warfare solution to just about anything the Americans and NATO can put on the battlefield. That's because the Russians are constantly updating and upgrading and incorporating this innovative way of fighting war. NATO's not. So this notion that there's a magic silver bullet that NATO can bring to bear on the battlefield is an absurdity.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.